So everyone, welcome to this last session of the Durban Trade and Climate Change Symposium. I would just like to say a few words about what we have done here over the past 2 days. My name is Ingrid Rigaud. I'm the manager of the Global Platform on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainable Energy in ICTSD. First, I'd like to say that in ICTSD we're very happy about the very constructive and positive collaboration we've had with our partners in organizing this symposium, the Department of Trade and Industry of South Africa and the World Trade Organization. In this symposium we have also had the privilege of working with 16 session organizers coming from the public sector, the private sector. They are leading think tanks and research networks and intergovernmental organizations. We've also had an incredibly knowledgeable and active audience. So I'd like to thank all of you for making this symposium happen. I also would like to thank Adriana Verdier, who is the project leader for this symposium in ICTSD. I think you all know her by now. So can we give a little round of applause to Adriana for all her work? So I'd just like to say a few words about what we have actually done during these 2 days. We've had different themes. Yesterday morning, the theme was on the African context and the specific challenges related to addressing climate change in a context of poverty. The concerns are, of course, many and very challenging, but the sessions were solutions-oriented, and they were discussing various tools and measures such as market access, technology transfer, financing, and harmonization of international standards. Yesterday afternoon, the focus was on response measures to climate change that may have an impact on trade. In particular, there was a strong focus on concerns for distortions in competitiveness and for concerns for carbon leakage. These are actually main concerns that may prevent countries from taking action to climate change. At the same time, the tools for addressing these concerns, they also represent challenges. And this was all very well highlighted in the various sessions looking at response measures yesterday. I should also mention that these concerns are very present in the climate change negotiations, and in particular at this COP. So we're very privileged to have the presence of a number of climate change negotiators, both yesterday and today, so that we could learn a bit about the positions in the climate change negotiations. This morning, the sessions focused on technology transfer and in particular on intellectual property rights. One of the questions discussed was how to strike a balance between the IP protection that can encourage and support innovation in climate-friendly technologies and the need for access to these technologies, in particular for developing countries. The afternoon was dedicated to looking at different sectors. We discussed agriculture, renewable energy, forestry, and biofuels. And we heard about obstacles to trade in these different sectors, both tariffs and non-tariff barriers, and how these still hamper trade in these sectors. We also heard that reducing these barriers would allow for trade to contribute not only to addressing climate change, but also to improve access to energy, access to food, and to social development, if, of course, accompanied by the right flanking measures and an enabling environment. I think that a common feature for all these sessions is that they have been solutions-oriented. And that's also a purpose of ICTSD activities generally. What we want to do when we work with trade in the context of climate change is to explore how trade can contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation, keeping in mind, of course, that trade can only be a part of the solution. And this is also the focus of this high-level session. The title of it is Trade and Climate Change, Where to Go from Durban. And this session is organized by the three hosts of the symposium. So the World Trade Organization, the Department of Trade and Industry, and ICTSD. So we have the pleasure of having a very distinguished panel of speakers. And I will give the floor to Amina Mohammed, who is going to moderate this session. And I will let her introduce the speakers. So Amina is the Deputy Executive Director of UNEP. So please have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. My name is Amina Mohammed, and as you've heard, I'm the Deputy Executive Director of UNEP. I am a new Deputy Executive Director. I've been there barely 3 months, so I hope you'll excuse me for any inadequacy in the presentations or the manner in which I conduct this session. But you know, Ricardo, I thought this was going to be a full room. I thought that we would have about 100 people in here, since really this topic is considered to be an incredibly hot topic right now. In fact, His Excellency the President of South Africa said that at a meeting that was held, a round table, this morning, that in fact humanity had never been so profoundly aware of climate change and all its implications, ramifications, and effects. And I dare say that just the amount of debate and controversy that has surrounded this issue has made it a top agenda item on the international scene. And therefore, obviously, because of the topic under discussion this evening, that of trade and climate change, whose linkages are now very well acknowledged, I thought would attract actually a bigger crowd. And so I'm not disappointed, because it basically means that there isn't much pressure on all of us. But let me say this, that in fact, this is a useful subject to be discussing now, because it's bound to develop, and it's bound to attract a lot more interest than it's doing right now. In fact, its importance has already been explicitly demonstrated by the increasing challenge to climate-related policies that we have all seen in the WTO settlement system. And they're being challenged because there is this perception that there's an alleged trade restrictiveness, or that such policies are actually discriminatory in nature. But distinguished participants, it is also true that in such a highly integrated and globalized economy, climate policies will have impacts on sourcing of resources, on production of those resources, and on trade methods and patterns. And through trade, the effects of climate change will be transmitted across regions, across sectors, and across markets. Optimal solutions to the climate riddle and a successful transition to a low-carbon economy require that negative impacts and limitations to development and sustainability are neutralized or minimized, and that growth patterns are enhanced. Enabling international trade and investment frameworks are critical in this regard. They're just as critical as supportive climate policies. The unrealized potential of trade policies in addressing both mitigation and adaptation challenges of climate change is an often overlooked dimension of these complex interlinkages. Trade is crucial in any diversification strategy to reduce vulnerability to climate change, and especially in the sectors that are most vulnerable to climate change. It's also critical in ensuring scale-up and diffusion of climate-related innovation and technologies. Moreover, reducing barriers to trade in climate-friendly goods and services, particularly in energy supply, can dramatically lower emissions while improving access to energy and enhancing energy security. These are imperatives for populations currently lacking access, as well as economies with rapidly growing energy needs and demands. At this COP, at COP17, governments are crafting a global policy plan, one that will eventually provide a coherent architecture of governance to address climate change through collective action. In the meantime, responses from a growing set of national and subnational governments are generating a complex web of regulations and market interventions against a backdrop of existing rules with either supportive or even hampering effects. Calls to reignite economies and to jumpstart dwindling growth in most of the OECD world add tension to this reality. This session, which gathers key thinkers and decision makers, will address the challenges posed to the trade and climate change governance systems. Speakers will explore synergies between trade policies and climate change options and action, and focus on identifying constructive innovation solutions. Now, we have a panel of extremely eminent personalities. At the far left, we have Kamde Yumkela. Kamde Yumkela was appointed Director General of UNIDO in December of 2005. And December 2009 was reconfirmed for a second term. So he's serving a second term as the Director General of UNIDO. He was also appointed by the Secretary General to head an energy panel. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to acknowledge the presence of the Director General of UNIDO amongst us. I'm sorry, it's not in this order of sitting, so you'll have to excuse me. Rachel Kite. Rachel Kite is the Vice President of Sustainable Development at the World Bank. As such, she has overall responsibilities for the organization's global work in agriculture, the environment, infrastructure, and urban development and social development. Could you kindly acknowledge Rachel? Now, there's somebody who actually doesn't need any introduction. That is Ricardo. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think he needs any introduction. I think we should just acknowledge his presence. We have next to him Ambassador Thomas Anker Christensen, who is the director at Global Green Growth Forum. So could you kindly also acknowledge his presence? We have next to the ambassador, Ms. Nonkululeko Nyambezi Haita. She's the CEO of ArcelorMittal South Africa. Could you please acknowledge her? We have Harsha Singh, who is the Deputy Director General at WTO. Please acknowledge this presence. And we have Minister Rob Davis, who is the Minister of Trade and Industry of the Republic of South Africa. Please. And I'm going to start off these panel discussions by addressing the Minister, Minister Rob Davis. Minister, at the current UNFCCC, South Africa has an important influence over how the policy process will be managed in the coming year. How can South Africa use its key role to promote the advancement of multilateral climate change action against the background of trade-related competitiveness, concerns that prevail in particular in the context of emerging economies, such as the basic? How can opportunities from trade be enhanced? in their lives.
Thank you very much. I think I want to start off by apologizing that I didn't make the opening session yesterday, but I think the slot was ably filled by my colleague Xavier Karim. Let me say that I think that concretely probably what we're looking to as an outcome from COP17 is the agreement on the establishment of a forum, the precise shape of which I think is going to be the subject of the negotiations, but a forum in which an in-depth discussion of issues of trade and climate change can be undertaken. Because I think that, as you outlined, and you and the chair outlined the issues that have been discussed here in this particular event, it's clear that there are a number of very, very profound and challenging issues that are before us. I would say that I would want to even insert a further dimension, because I think that the trade dimension and the trade and climate change has got to be linked to something else, and that is the opportunities for development that need to take place. And I think that what is happening in the world right now is that we are all making various commitments and in varying degrees implementing those towards moving towards a lower carbon economy. At the same time, I think there is an industrial revolution that is going on. It is the industrial revolution around the greening of the economy. That includes green energy production and renewables, but it also includes a whole series of measures right across production chains that are going to change the content of those. And I think that one of the issues from the point of view of basic countries, which I think are emerging economies, but more generally from the point of view of developing countries, is that we need to make sure that we have our share of industrial development arising from this. If we look at the last wave of industrial development, that was the ICT revolution. Developing countries, and certainly our country, but the African continent as a whole, I would say the African continent rather than developing countries in the total, but the African continent, South Africa, we certainly related to that as service providers of somebody else's technology and somebody else's industrial production. And I think this time round, it's imperative that that doesn't happen. That's going to be part of the development efforts, but I think it's also going to be part of the ability to be able to build the constituencies to support moving to a lower carbon economy. If we can have an equitable share of the benefits of this transition, then I think we're onto a good track. So I think that the trade regime has got to accommodate a transfer of technology, has got to accommodate a balance, as you mentioned earlier, a balance between intellectual property rights and the dispersal of that knowledge. It's got to make sure that the burdens of adjustment are not disproportionately loaded on developing countries, and I think a lot of the issues which were discussed, I believe, in more detail, things like border adjustment taxes, standards, eco-labeling, and things like that. I think these are issues which I think have got to emerge from the forum discussion with a series of proposals that don't mean that they are disproportionately loaded on particular countries. Now, some of those discussions are probably theoretical, that nobody has at this moment in time introduced border adjustment taxes. But I can tell you that some measures have already had an impact. I'll give one concrete example, that a European country which is a customer of wine from South Africa introduced a new set of regulations that bottling should take place in the name of saving carbon and reducing the use of carbon in transport in their country rather than in our country. And what this meant was, it meant that the bottling jobs were frankly exported from South Africa to Europe. And I think that if that's going to be the pattern, and it's already happened, that's going to be a major problem. So I think that we are some distance away from saying what kind of regulatory regime, what kind of supportive regime in terms of trade that's going to underpin an equitable industrialization needs to take place. I think we're some distance from that. But I think that we have seen a number of issues identified, and that what is necessary is that we have a forum where these can be discussed in depth. So I think that's what we will be pushing for. You mentioned the basic, and let me say a couple of things about the basic, and I think it's one of the important points which is occurring here and in the WTO. It is a fact of life that the dynamism in the world economy as it is now is located in so-called emerging markets, emerging economies. That is a fact of life. But I think at the same time, although growth rates in these areas may be higher, and although a number of them are becoming more significant players in international trade, the fact of the matter is that we are very far, all of us, as emerging economies, we are very far from being developed countries. If we use measures like GDP per capita, industrial production per capita, the composition of our trade, what kind of products are we producing, where are high value-added products, I think we are very distant from the advanced developed countries. And so I think the principle, which is called here common but differentiated responsibilities, and which is called less than full reciprocity in the WTO, that principle is a principle that has to be underpinning and informing all of these efforts. I think that's how I would respond to your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But if you carry that a little further, I have, for instance, had other developing countries talk about a second level of common but differentiated responsibility between the countries of the basic countries and others. What would you say to that?
Well, I think that least developed countries is a well-recognized category, for example, and the expectations on what least developed countries can do is something which needs to be understood as well, that in fact basically they have nothing that they should be doing, and that we should be supporting the least developed countries, particularly on the trade front. But I think that essentially the principle is that we should be making, we should be sharing the burdens involved proportionately according to what we can bear, and I think that the advantages and the benefits should be going disproportionately towards development and developing countries. I think that's the essential principle.
Thank you very much. Now, come to Yumkela. The issue of trade liberalization and scaling up of access to technologies, including technologies for renewable energy, and diffusion of that technology to countries in order to allow actually for better access and more affordable access to energy. And I know that in the panel that you chair, that's an issue that you have been discussing. Now, just to bring back, I think, the subject to climate change and trade, how do you see the issue of trade affecting access to energy for all, which is something that you're aiming for?
Well, let me put it in context. 3 years ago, my friends from the World Bank and myself, we quickly, in 2 weeks, put a paper together and submitted it to the Chief Executives Board chaired by the Secretary General, making a case for why we should be looking at energy issues in their own right, and making a case that energy access was central to the issues related to climate change, food security, water security, and many of the challenges we face today. The biggest supporter of that paper was Pascal Lamy. Pascal and I in the morning, we were going around, he said, I'm so happy you brought this here. He said, because it's beginning to hit us at WTO already. We're talking climate change, he said, but we're not focusing enough on energy. Now, since then, 3 years later, this year, September, this year, the General Assembly, the only initiative launched by the Secretary General is his new initiative on sustainable energy for all. And here we've set up a high-level panel, 35 people with more CEOs, almost 80% of them are chief executive officers, technology companies like Vestas, Suntech, utility companies, Eskom, Duke Energy, but also banks. Because we recognize that you cannot solve climate change without dealing with the energy issue. Also, in the interest of developing countries is also to grow and restructure their economies. They need energy systems. But we see a big connection between energy security, food security, and water security, whether in urban centers or in rural areas. These are now interconnected, so we talk a lot about the nexus. So our first goal was to make energy issues central to the discussions. Second, we did not want energy issues captured by negotiations, because we believe, many of us, including Rachel and myself and others, that whatever happens, we should begin to address the issue of energy access. We should take rapid action on efficiency, but also increasing the share of renewables. And we see these as three pillars of the energy initiative by the Secretary General. We have this panel. We're developing an action agenda between, it was just launched in September. So between now and Rio, we're supposed to launch an action agenda. How can we achieve universal access by 2030, connecting the 1.3, 1.4 billion people that have no access to electricity? How can we provide clean cooking solutions to the 2.7 billion that use biomass, so they cut down the trees, and then cause about 2 million deaths every year, which in some reports they say it's more than HIV, AIDS, and malaria combined. Most of them women and children. So that's the job we are supposed to do. Now, in looking at this, we see the importance of trade. Very crucial. We know already that in some countries there are significant barriers to the trade of renewable energy technologies, which we need for distributive, decentralized power production. Even if you want to do agribusiness projects in rural areas to reduce post-harvest losses, you need an energy source. If you want to, I mean, I have examples now from Africa that I can give. We're trying to promote the uptake of simple solar lighting systems. Governments put tariffs on it. It's their main source of income. And so this very cheap device you buy from India suddenly now has high tariff. It's not accessible to the poor anymore. These are real issues. But we know already, and this is why we want to commend the organizers of this forum. I give you a concrete example where we've been looking at structuring the Rio +20 discussions. Let's leave COP for a minute. And so we gave it a theme in New York. Member states gave it a theme, green economy. The most controversial aspect of that discussion, even to agree on a definition of green economy, is that, what it should not be. And for most developing countries, they don't want the label green economy to be another pretense for trade barriers. It is real, it is strong, and so it's disrupting the discussions in New York for 5 months. So you go there, everybody is saying what it should not be, and you look at the list, they don't want it to be trade barriers. These are real fears, and they're very concrete. So we cannot underestimate the fact that, yes, some greening, as Rob has said, can be a trade barrier. And for developing countries, that's an issue. For us in this initiative, we want to see how we reduce those barriers. And so I was just striking a deal here in the corner here just a few minutes ago. As part of the Secretary General's initiative, what we'll do with ICTSD and others is to begin to look at these many components of renewable energy technologies, look at the kinds of barriers that exist across countries. Let's see if we can have some commitments in Rio, not in COP, but at least in Rio, that countries will make a commitment to remove those barriers as part of their own contribution to sustainable development. We need to do it if we're going to do the scale-up investments that we're looking for. And in fact, for the basic solutions that are available today that we know low-income communities can access, if in fact we can convince governments that, look, you can forego that import duty on those basic elements just to give access to these simple technologies. My last comment is just to endorse what Rob Davis said. This is about an industrial revolution. 2 months ago, Jeremy Rifkin launched his new book, The Third Industrial Revolution. I have seen him now in Europe. He was with me last week, but I've seen him in Denmark, keynote speaker for the new Prime Minister Denmark. He is with Angela Merkel. He is with Barroso. His 5 pillars. The third industrial revolution will be driven by new energy sources intersecting with IT. So he talks about an energy internet, where people can produce their own energy and with smart grids, send it off to other locations. This changes the debate on energy. But for developing countries, Africa in particular, we don't want to be left behind. We financed the first 2 industrial revolutions. Our raw materials went off. Rob is right. We need to create the jobs. We're trading already. but the trade is not benefiting us. We are always cited as the worst statistics on poverty or anything. This time in the third industrial revolution, we want to ride the green wave. So building the capacities of those countries to be part of this green wave and making sure they can create the jobs for their populations that are growing very fast. After all, the Arab Spring started in Africa, and these youth are not waiting. They will go to the streets if, in fact, Rob and others don't create the jobs very fast. So it is about the third industrial revolution and how they can be part of it, and energy systems are central. And so trade related to transfer of energy technologies is very, very important. I apologize, I have to go do a keynote across the hall here and facilitate another discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think to carry on that discussion, you're right. The Arab Spring began in Africa. If we are not careful, it will become an African spring, and sooner rather than later, probably a global spring. So thank you very much for being with us. Now to carry that discussion a little further, I'm going to invite Ricardo. And it is because actually the question that I intended to ask you is so closely tied to what Kamde has just said. And it's basically how can trade contribute to allowing countries to meet energy demand without, in fact, adding further stress to the atmosphere? And how could trade barriers to sustainable energy best be addressed? How can these trade barriers best be addressed?
So thank you, Amina. I think that after what Kamde just did, which is a very eloquent case for acting on trade to promote more robust markets that could then respond to these challenges to scale, both to scale up innovation, production, and trade in renewable energies, but also to use renewable energies to provide access to those that don't have access to modern forms of energy today. It's hard to follow, as I was saying. Kamde make a very good case. Now, how do you do it in practical terms? And I think that that's the sense of your question. Right now, in the WTO and for the past 10 years, there has been a discussion going on the liberalization of environmental goods and services. A great deal of learning has happened in those discussions. There is a good understanding now of the type of barriers that are faced by this type of products. If we focus on sustainable energy goods and services, there is a good understanding of, again, what kind of products we're talking about. And let me get a bit technical without losing you there. If in trade terms we disaggregate the technologies that we are looking for, we're then talking about a plethora of opportunities for all countries to participate in the value chains that generate the final products of those renewable energies. So if we're talking about a windmill, an example that I used to make, we're talking about 150 or so components. And in putting together that windmill, in a previous session we had this afternoon, I was showing how developing countries, including Vietnam and others, have become suppliers of components to the windmill industry, for instance, in the US. And how just from 2005 to 2010, their participation has grown in a very impressive manner. Now, this is the case across the board for all renewable energy technologies. And we have done the mapping over years with experts looking at who produces what, but also who has the capability to produce. And where are we with respect to innovation? And then we have also done the analysis of what are the trade drivers, the investment drivers, but also the barriers to that production and that trade. We know that to face the challenges, to respond to the challenges on mitigation, according to the World Bank, to studies that have been published, we would need to deploy a great number of all these technologies all over the world on a year basis for the next 40 years. So we're talking about increasing the share of the participation of renewable energies in the supply of energy, which is a rapidly growing supply, from somewhere around 15% today to about 40% by 2020 and 2030 and so on. And that means that, again, the opportunities are very big. Last point there is that, as you said before, in a rapidly integrating world, one that now is very deeply integrated indeed, where many countries obviously depend on exports for their revenues, but also in a world that is heterogeneous in their endowments on energy supply, but also their capabilities, again, for production and so on, that the case for trade is just a very obvious case. One discussion that we could have, and we can leave this for later on in the debate, is where and how do we do this? So if the WTO right now is going through some difficulties in finalizing the Doha round of negotiations, how can we respond with the urgency that is required to this agenda of liberalization? How do we put it forward, and who would do it? And there are many options. Countries many times sort of stay, as a vice minister of South Africa was saying recently, in sort of spinning in the mud. And we need to get out of that situation, and we need to move forward. So there are opportunities at the bilateral level, at the plurilateral level, at the regional level, but also the multilateral level to start resolving these issues.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to move to another area and invite Nyembezi Heita. Steel, and she's the CEO of ArcelorMittal, is a highly carbon-intensive and heavily traded sector. And it's commonly mentioned as a target for controversial border measures. The sector therefore faces an important challenge to abate its emissions. Maybe you could talk about what the role of trade in promoting such abatement opportunities is, and how can a positive contribution of trade in this product, in this commodity, be enhanced?
Thank you, Amina. Well, let me just start off by saying steel is today probably one of the most heavily traded metals in the world. And it's very easy to forget that it wasn't always so. Very, very recently, or at least within recent memory, steel was produced within very protected national markets. A variety of governments perceived it to be of strategic advantage for the particular country. And so there were very, very high tariff barriers in this particular market. And over time, through the efforts of multilateral organizations such as WTO, this started to come down to the point where today, for example, at ArcelorMittal South Africa, up to a third of our output is sold in markets outside South Africa today. But if you look at it globally, up to about 70% of every ton of steel produced crosses a border in some form or another. So it's a very good example of what can be achieved by just driving market access. So you can well understand that from particularly a developing market operator, for us this is a very nervous time, because some of the comments that have been made about the possibility of climate change actions beginning to impinge on market access and being used as a barrier to trade is very, very real, and actually causes a great deal of nervousness in developing markets generally, but among steel producers more specifically. Now, I must say that the issue that Rob talked about in terms of common but differentiated approaches for countries in terms of climate change and its actions poses real difficulty when you take it down to a sector. In, as I said, a heavily traded sector, how do you actually achieve that? Because essentially we all meet as steel producers in common markets and we compete. So we don't really have an answer as to how one may square up between developed market producers who've had a lot of time to invest in abatement technologies, in less carbon-intensive technologies, and how you allow your developing market counterpart to reach that level. Now, just to give you an example, for instance, in Europe, European steel producers have, over the past 30 years, invested incrementally over time to a point where they were able to reduce their carbon emissions by some 50%. It's not a number that you hear often because it wasn't primarily driven by greenhouse gas investments. It was driven by the need to reduce cost, because the less carbon you put in your furnaces, the less cost it is, and therefore it enhances your profitability. Now, if you're trying to do the same thing over a fairly contracted period of time, we simply can't cope as emerging market producers. So what needs to be thought about is some kind of transition period where there will be an equal treatment between developed and developing market producers in some form of way. Now, yesterday I said through various presentations on border controls and concern from developed market producers about leakage, carbon leakage, and the like. And that, again, you must understand, raises huge issues from a developing market perspective. So then how do you use trade to actually try and mitigate those impacts? Everybody's been clamoring for the so-called Green Climate Fund, and so I think you will find that we will also, from an industry perspective, be looking to tap into some of those funds to try and scale up on our abatement, on the use of abatement technologies. Best available technologies are available in the industry, widely so, and can be accessed by anybody. The only issue is cost. And so if you think that the steel industry over the past 3 years has faced very, very weak markets, this is probably the worst possible time you could be asking people to invest. But invest, we do have to, but essentially what we would be arguing for is the time to play catch up to the rest of the world so that, in effect, you can do so without disrupting trade, because we do need that to continue. I think the moderator started off by talking about how you compensate the people who've invested billions of dollars in technology who are not going to merely agree to a wholesale transfer of the intellectual property, which is dead correct. So I think the issue is skills transfer, know-how diffusion through trade, but find a way, in one way or another, to compensate people for doing so.
Well, but I think that, in fact, you touch on areas that the minister touched on, because economic growth and development is an imperative for developing countries and for LDCs. Now, obviously, within a multilateral rule-based system, it's possible to differentiate between the different players in the sector, those from the developed world and those from the developing world. And I think that's probably why you'd need multilateral trade rules to be able to phase in the new technology, to be able to actually use the common but differentiated treatment, to have some safeguards, in place for developing countries and for.
Well, I think the issue once you take it down to an industry sector is how practically that would work. So in essence, the steel industry favors far more a sectoral approach that would devise a globally harmonized approach for the whole sector, because we can't quite see how it would work in any other way.
I wish I could actually move on to Harsha, because then he'll probably talk about all the other sectors that have been able, to do it. But it's because they started some time back, and it's also been for them a curve. But I'd like to move on to Rachel Carl, because you told me that you may have to also leave. And Rachel is from the World Bank, and so I'm going to be asking her questions related to resources, and whether in fact they're currently channeling those resources for economic transformation, enterprise and trade development, infrastructure upgrading, and so on, following the demands for the greening of economies.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I just want to have a huge thank you for the invitation to ICTSD, because I've been stuck in a sweltering car park all day, and this is the nicest air-conditioned meeting I've been in all day. So, Ricardo, thank you. I'm sure you're offsetting the meeting, but anyway. And I'm very pleased to be here. But, I think that from a development perspective, and from the perspective of how to support countries, developing countries, on their path to sort of greener growth, greener and more inclusive growth, the worst thing that could possibly happen is that we get stuck between Doha and Durban. Yes. I mean, this would be a Greek tragedy. We need, my boss, Bob Zoellick, has been absolutely clear that we need Doha, we need trade to function as an enabler of development. And we need Durban to reach an agreement on how we're going to continue the conversation around the ever more complex relationship between climate change and trade. Kande talked about renewable energy technologies, and I think that's the sort of hot button issue. That's where you see the focus of debate between Europe and China, the US, the rest of the world. And certainly from a green growth perspective, if you look at Africa, you see the potential of the renewable energy market. You see all kinds of innovation going into building the possibility of long-term financing for green infrastructure development or climate-resilient infrastructure development. And of course, the perversities of border tax arrangements, the perversities of green subsidies that may be applied in different parts of the system, are going to work against that. But I think that we also see dilemmas, obviously, in the carbon markets. We also see dilemmas in the increasing focus, certainly the focus that we've been bringing to Durban on the agricultural and forest sectors as well. You've got to be able to move food around the world in order to address food security, but also in order to really shift a little bit the debate to what adaptation-based mitigation is really all about, which is being able to produce food and create resiliency and meet food security needs and feed the cities which are growing up in Africa faster than almost any other continent. So all of these drivers of climate change, but also drivers of greener growth, are going to have to be dealt with. And I think I desperately hope that Durban agrees that we can have this conversation and have it in a productive way in a forum, because then we'll have to work out whether or not we are prepared to lead so that we get the speed and scale, both because we get progress on the trade side and because we get progress on the climate side. But in addition to that, I think there's also another issue related to competitiveness. And one of the keys to competitiveness in Africa in particular, but all around the world, is regional integration as well. So when we look at the climate resilient infrastructure, the energy projects which are needed in order to meet the energy access for all goals, but also in order to ensure a pathway to greener growth in Africa, we're really talking about taking projects to scale. And many of these projects to scale are going to be regional, or are going to at least serve more than one national market. And so at the same time as we're putting enormous amounts of energy into supporting regional organizations in Africa, whether it's the East African Community or whether it's UMOA in West Africa or others, in order to create the same kind of investment climate across all of these countries, as the parity and interoperability of investment rules, etc. So we need to make sure that we're not at the same time then introducing things that are going to make it more difficult, under the auspices of either, protecting green, but also climate change. For most African farmers who seek to have access to international markets, there is this huge promise that's held open to them. The promise that if they meet certain standards of sustainability, they meet standards, phytosanitary standards, they can get access to global supply chains, they can get access to longer-term financing on better terms, etc. They are at the same time, that's the sort of the promise. The fear is that new generations of footprinting are going to actually become an additional barrier. And so, the technical assistance that's needed in order to help those products be able to get onto the bottom rung of global supply chains and then move up, that's going to be important. And so, there's going to be a whole question around how the technical assistance and the support to the small farmer, to the small business person in Africa, so that they may be part of a globally competitive economy. So on the one hand, we're extremely excited. I mean, I'm talking just about Africa, but I could give you a different speech for different parts of the world. Extraordinarily excited about the story of growth in Africa. Extraordinarily excited about the growing competitiveness and the possibilities of investing in Africa and the success that is here. At the same time, needing to base greener growth for African countries on both their own understanding of what mitigation means for them going forward, but adaptation-based mitigation, looking at landscapes and looking at, basically not repeating the practice of other parts of the developed world in terms of how they grew. So growth that is inclusive. And I think if we don't have a forum coming out of Durban where we can really bring the trade dialogue and the climate change dialogue together, not just about renewable energy, but on a number of the different sectors or wedges that are producing emissions and which form part of competitiveness for the future, then I think we're storing up a very big problem for development. So we come at this from a development organization, from a development perspective. We're about helping make new markets, new green markets work for the poor. And I think the sooner we get into a constructive conversation about this, a multifaceted conversation, then the better.
Thank you very much. Although I would dare say that in fact Doha and Durban are linked already. They're linked in WTO. In fact, not even Durban. It's probably Doha and Copenhagen and Cancun that were linked in. So it's going to be difficult to actually, look at them in isolation because of the issues that are coming up.
Yeah, I agree. I think the point I was making is that that could be a chasm that we get stuck in and we can't climb out of, or you see the dialogue as an opportunity. So
yeah, no, absolutely. Now I'm going to move to Harsha very quickly, so that then we can have our last speaker, who is the ambassador, and then probably give an opportunity to the panelists to add anything else that they'd like to say, because we want to turn this into an interactive session and get questions from the other part of the room. So Harsha, climate change, energy, increasingly entering the WTO, both through cases, and those have been referred to, and also in discussions at the negotiations in the Committee on Trade and Energy. At the same time, there is no proactive policy process going on in the WTO on climate change, unless you tell me otherwise. What should the role of the WTO be in enhancing the opportunities of trade to address climate change into the future? In addition to that, what are the potential synergies with the UNFCCC process and other relevant processes?
Thank you very much. We've had a very rich discussion, and we've talked about various difficult situations the world is facing. We've talked about the fact that the multilateral solutions are not coming forward. And actually, this is a time when we need multilateral solutions the most, because these problems are not going to be sorted otherwise. And it's the time when we are facing the greatest problem, getting a common multilateral commitment to do so. It is in this background that your question becomes relevant, that what is it that the WTO doing in very direct terms with respect to climate change. It's not as if we are not directly discussing climate change per se, but a number of aspects of WTO, a number of common initiatives which are there contribute to addressing climate change concerns. it's a rule-based multilateral trading system which has sustainable development as one of its main objectives. The WTO system provides a stable, predictable trading regime with open, growing markets. And we've seen the value of that in a number of comments. And these growing markets actually, they facilitate environmentally friendly goods and services. They facilitate access to mitigation and adaptation technologies, either as technologies embodied in products or through encouraging market development, part of the growth process, participation, which Minister talked about. And the larger markets also help reduce costs of green products, green technologies, efficient resources. The resources are used much more efficiently, and that itself is a good contribution towards reducing the CO2 effect or the climate change aspects, and generating opportunities which come through trade, through all these exchanges I'm talking about, help with development process, of course, combined with domestic initiatives, which you have to take for distribution, etc. So we have committees and other transparency mechanism, notification procedures, etc. When they are discussed in committees, members can monitor what's happening, consider the factual situation, because one of the things which was talked about was better information systems. So together with what are the opportunities, what are the possibilities for green economy initiatives, green markets, etc., technologies, we also need to know what is the situation on the ground in terms of policies. And often there is not enough clarity on that. And the WTO system can, the monitoring system, the discussions, the information sessions we have can contribute very effectively to that. And we also use all this and the participation of, active participation of members to devise capacity building and technical assistance programs. In addition, the fears which have been talked about by more than one member of this distinguished panel, that markets may close down as a result of emphasis on climate change. What we need to have a balance between two important policy objectives. One is to actually keep markets open. That's the fear, that initiatives should not be put in place which will close these markets in an arbitrary or unjustifiable discriminatory process or with protectionist intent. So that is a very clear criteria in the WTO, that you shall not be using arbitrary or unjustifiably discriminatory policies with protectionist intent. But at the same time, you also are allowed policy space to address justifiable environmental objectives. So this balance is very important, and the WTO system has that. So one of the things, in fact, when I was looking at the topic, trade and climate change, where to go from Durban, I think one of the important objectives we should always keep emphasizing is to keep this system strong and vibrant, and actively engage in the days ahead after Durban also, to have a balanced package as per the mandate which the members decide in the Doha context. So in addition to this important objective, keeping in mind the various overlaps which I've already told you, how WTO activities contribute to the objective of climate change, we must keep certain key issues in mind. And I'll want to mention 5 of them. One is positive efforts on transfer of climate technology. Another one relates to private standards. I think capacity augmentation becomes extremely important. Better collection and exchange of information, which I have emphasized, must continue in a far more organized and collective way to make it much more effectively available to, especially to those countries which find it very difficult to have access to it. And of course, address the concerns about trade measures which have been mentioned. With respect to the ongoing efforts and discussions on facilitating transfer technologies, I think we can seek very different practical ways in addition to whatever is being talked about here to enhance technology transfer, to take it forward. And what I feel is we need to consider more detail on the basis of the factual situation as it exists and feasibility of doing it. Whatever can be done quickly should be put in place in a structured way. On private standards, I think maybe a greater effort should be made to put disciplines in place, to give predictability, to give transparency, perhaps the kind of predictability, transparency practices which are encompassed in the Code of Good Practices in the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement of WTO. Again, information and exchange systems and mechanisms to address market access concerns even for those standards, because they are right now outside the WTO context. Better information I've emphasized, capacity augmentation. We have in WTO the Aid for Trade initiative, which looks at things in a very structured, interconnected manner. I think that's a good model to take to trade and capacity. We need to take a step back and bear in mind the wider current and medium-term implications of these. And my feeling is that if these are not justifiable, these implications are not going to be positive. Negotiations are likely to raise several conflicting issues. As Minister Rob Davies has said, we need greater clarity and understanding of the relevant issues involved, and the forum which he talked about for in-depth discussion is a very good idea. Events like this conference also, the last 2 days, I think has led to clarification of a number of issues which can be summarized and shared with all the delegations so that we close the information gap, we clarify meaningful options as well as implications and consider whether they are effective. So I think these are the various ways we can go ahead, but within all this, to keep the WTO system strong because it meets all the objectives which you have talked about.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, and that in fact brings me, in fact, quite nicely to the question for the next speaker, Ambassador Thomas Christensen, who is also the Undersecretary for Global Challenges at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Denmark. Removing obstacles to trade in sustainable energy technologies and services is one important step in facilitating the shift to renewable energy, which is required to effectively address climate change. One contributor for facilitating this shift is through a plurilateral approach. And I think we've talked here about multilateralism, plurilateralism, regionalism, and so on and so forth. Now, do you think that if we actually had a sustainable energy trade agreement, would be able to address all these concerns in a more balanced manner than is being done now? I mean, if you listen to all the discussions that we've had, basically relates to the differences in the levels of development, what we need to address the growth imperatives of certain groups of countries, the need for a system that would actually take into account the concerns that these countries have in terms of ensuring their development is not hampered by unnecessary obstacles to access markets and technologies as well as resources. So do you think that, in fact, if we had a process in place to negotiate a sustainable energy trade agreement that would be addressing these concerns, and that would be a feasible way to address this climate trade nexus?
Thank you, Amina. I guess that is what you might call a leading question. And thank you for inviting me. I should just tell the audience very fast that I'm by no means a trade expert, and I feel very humbled to be invited to this panel, because I think my strength is more in general diplomacy than in particular in the trade area. The challenges I have the responsibility for is actually not the trade area, but it's more climate, environment, energy, food, health, etc., UN system, multilateral affairs. But where my interests also coincide with the trade, and if you bear over with me, just spend 2 minutes on that. It's an initiative that the Danish government has started up, the so-called Global Green Growth Forum, that had its first meeting this October, jointly organized with South Korea and Mexico. And of course we had a number of other countries, but more importantly many organizations and the private sector joining us. And the focus of this forum was really, if you want, in the absence of an agreement on a carbon price, in the absence of a global agreement in the COP, not so much in the absence of the Doha round finishing, but also taking that into account. What can interested parties do to scale up, to speed up, exactly what Rachel was saying, to go for solutions that could be agreed to amongst some parties in the private sector, some governments, some interested organizations. And we had a very good forum where we discussed both the energy, transport, water, but also had a very sharp focus on public procurement and indeed trade. And that's where I'm coming back to the trade area. And in fact, the Deputy Minister of Trade from South Africa joined Ricardo and the Danish Minister for Trade in a discussion on a plurilateral initiative that could be launched, was in fact launched at the forum for a so-called sustainable energy trade agreement, which I think, Ricardo, you are of course the expert, but which is a plurilateral sectoral agreement on trade in sustainable energy goods and services, as well as public procurement. And the idea really is to gather enough interested parties around such a plurilateral agreement that it could fly. It's of course important that it is fully compatible with the WTO and the most favored nations principle. I should also add very fast that as I'm sure you all know, when it comes to trade, it is the European Commission that is negotiating for the EU, but I think individual member states still have a margin of maneuver in supporting initiatives like this one. The Danish government has the presidency of the European Union as of 1st of January, and I know that the Minister for Trade, who will be actually joining Ricardo in an event at the margins of the WTO ministerial meeting in Geneva next week, that in that event she intends to launch concrete initiatives for the Danish EU presidency. So I'm also making a little advertisement for the ICTSD's side event next week. And in our EU presidency, we will really make a strong effort to promote green trade liberalization and indeed the green agenda, not only in trade, but in energy efficiency and natural resources, and even have a shot at the EU's budget and within that the agricultural policy. I should add that there is a new Danish government for the last 2 months with a very strong green agenda. We've also set new targets for our own, a target for 50% of our energy by wind in 2020, a reduction by 40% in 2020, and so on and so forth. So to get back to the plurilateral agreement, we of course know that there are many who are skeptical vis-a-vis such initiatives, and that really that there is this notion that I think also Minister Davis was talking about, that there might be advantages for certain countries vis-a-vis others. And I think if such a plurilateral agreement is to be carried forward, really it would also have to take into account the concerns of developing countries to ensure that they also stand to gain from fairer prices on products. That goes without saying. So I think there are actions that can be taken by countries that are interested, and where we don't have to wait for the slowest ships in the convoy. But I think the most important is to bridge the north-south divide here. Indeed, not to make it a north-south issue, but to try to find those win-win situations where things can actually be carried forward. And I know, Ricardo, that's also the whole point of the initiative that you have launched.
And I think you'd have a lot of support if you carried on that initiative, but at the same time, as you yourself has indicated, used the EU agriculture budget to tackle the green technology access for developing and least developed countries. I think if you're able to do the two together, then you'd get a lot of support for it. But otherwise, I don't know that I should invite Mr. Davis to just comment on that type of agreement, and whether you think that is something that countries should actually pursue.
Well, I think I would say, let's look at the content, the details, and things like that. I'm not going to make an instant judgment. I think I should also say that we, in this discussion, I think we're going to have a frank discussion about what is the appropriate trade regime that supports industrial development in developing countries. There's been a huge assumption that it's all about liberalizing trade, but actually I think that there is a need for developing countries to use policy space to support industrial development. And I want to give a very concrete example, actually. There was mention made of regional integration. There is a project which was supported by UNCTAD, which has set up a compact fluorescent light bulb factory in Lesotho, which is the least developed country, one of our neighbors. Now that project is absolutely, totally and utterly dependent on, one, a customs union that exists between ourselves, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia and Swaziland, as well as a tariff which is in place and operational across that customs union for a period of time to support that factory in Lesotho. Eventually its intention is that it will become strong enough and competitive enough, and then it will be able to reach out into the broader SADC region. And I should just say that the World Bank lady was very importantly making the point about regional integration and so on. And there's a very major project underway in Africa now, which is the tripartite free trade agreement, SADC, COMESA, and East African Community, precisely to build a sustainable and sizable regional market, not just for renewable energy technologies, but which can also support renewable energy technologies, which will be more than half the African continent, either in population or in GDP terms, a sizable block. And I think that will be a very, very major development. So I don't think everything is in the multilateral court. There are things going on the regional level. There can be other kinds of initiatives. We need to look at those. But I do think that in the end of the day, we do support a multilateral approach, because in the end of the day, the multilateral approach sets the rules. Whether those rules on trade and climate change are set in the context of the UNFCCC or they're set in the WTO, I think that remains to be seen. But there does need to be a rules-setting process that disciplines a lot of these actions. I think otherwise we find that this is the problem with the unilateral trade measures, is they're not subject to any discipline. And whether they are actually made in the name of climate change and sincerely intended to do that, but then are having an inadvertent effect, or somebody is just using the name of climate change to put in place protections measures, doesn't really matter actually, because the same impact quite often can result. So I think that's the challenge. So I think we're going to need something at a variety of different levels eventually, and I think we need this, as everyone has said, this full-on intense conversation.
Nonkululeko, policy space.
Well, this is now Rob's area, and he's sitting right there. But I agree with him. We've launched a huge number of initiatives within South Africa, and in fact, one of them was mentioned in the session just prior to this on renewable energy, where we have as a country in our resource plan have staked our claim to increasing renewable energy as an energy source, but want to use that also as an underpin for reindustrialization of the country. So I could not agree more.
Okay. I think now we're going to turn to our esteemed participants, and I turn the floor over to you. If there are any issues that you'd like to raise, any comments you want to make, any questions you want to ask, any clarifications that you'd like to seek, the floor is open. I think we have about 10 to 15 minutes for that. And then we'll come back to the panelists for a final word. And if you have any questions to ask, please tell us your name, the organization, and who you would like to respond to your question. Well, I think we were very thorough. Asha, you want to say something?
Yeah, actually, very important points about regional market expansion, possibility of enhancing or using economies of scale in order to achieve greater efficiencies have been made. And Mr. Davies also talked about, if I may just paraphrase, the two legs of multilateral and regional or plurilateral, which can be used to enhance the conditions for greater trade. It's the multilateral trading system, which is the WTO, actually takes this as one of its components. It's only that when it is done, it should be done in such a way that the normal disciplines of the system are maintained, and that if it's it fits in very well also with the objectives of using it as a growth strategy, as a development strategy, if these agreements cover most or substantial part of the trade between the countries concerned. So it's all part of the multilateral trading system disciplines itself, and to the extent capacity augmentation, etc., is concerned, WTO together with others, and including the government of South Africa, we have worked on it. So the important point is to keep that discipline, the same way as we need to keep the discipline for other measures which people are fearful about.
Well, thank you very much. Still no questions? Yeah, well, there are a few now. Very good.
You stimulated them.
The third row.
Questions before.
You have two questions. Right there.
My question is Vesile Kulaçoğlu from WTO. My question is to Minister Davis about this forum on the response measures. Wouldn't be a governance issue that there is a forum discussing trade in the climate context when you have yourself said that these measures, response measures, are protectionist trade measures. They're not climate measures. So if they are trade measures, why is it proposed to discuss them in this forum, future forum?
Well, Minister.
Do you want to take them?
Okay, should we? Yeah, maybe that's a good idea.
Thank you. Mahesh Subatan from ICTSD in Geneva. My question is to Ms. Nyembezi Heta. Ms. Heta, you mentioned the role that the Green Fund can play in the UNFCCC. What role do you feel that the private sector, especially in some of these carbon-intensive sectors, companies like yours in the steel, aluminum sectors, what role can the Green Fund and the technology mechanism play in ensuring a level capacity, for countries to be on the same scale as far as carbon emissions are concerned? Because obviously it is a question of the cost, it's a question of the technological capacity that possibly many developing countries lack. So do you feel that particularly in these sectors which matter for climate change, the fund and the mechanism could play a role in facilitating a more even playing field between developed and developing countries? Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Yeah, then I want to. There's one more here.
Adriana Verdier, ICTSD, also to Ms. Aita. Just thinking about the steel industry, and I would like to know if ArcelorMittal is looking into the life cycle analysis of steel and also looking into iron ore and how it is produced and take into account so the inputs and all the other products that you produce with steel, so to have a better understanding of the carbon outputs of steel, looking into the entire cycle analysis. If there are any studies that you're following these types of things. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think Minister first.
Okay. I mean, I think that the dialogue is at a point where a lot of issues have been raised in the context of the UNFCCC, and that the relationship between green industrialization, climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and trade is posed here. And I think that, that it's not absolutely clear at this point in the discussion that it's simply a WTO matter. I mean, some aspects of it, I think, eventually may end up there. So that would be, I think, my first point. I don't think that the conversation, the discussion has reached a point where we can just say it just goes over into the WTO. That would be the first point. The second point is I think that the WTO has got a huge unfinished business, which in our view is the development round, and that it's not something you can just say drop all of that and go on with this. So I think that would be my second reason why I would not want to say right at this time that these are simply things that get transferred over to WTO. I think that's a broad consensus, as I understand it, that's beginning to emerge around this negotiation, that this forum is a kind of halfway house. We have the intense discussion, and then obviously we discuss where things are located in terms of the actual emergence of a framework of disciplines, most likely, that we need.
Thank you very much.
All right, let me start with the issue of the Green Fund. The issue, I think I shouldn't leave an impression that all developing market steel producers are at the same level, because they're certainly not. There is a wide variation in terms of where people are and what they've invested in the past to meet global compliance standards for a variety of environmental issues. As you know, it's not just a question of carbon in the steel industry, it's also a question of all sorts of other nasties that we emit in making steel. But what the industry has been very conscious about is, even though we can't completely eliminate the footprint, environmental footprint of steelmaking, there are technologies available today that will mitigate that footprint. And over time, there have been companies that have been investing in that off their own bat, and also to meet environmental laws in their own countries. So that is a fairly substantial investment of capital on an ongoing basis for the industry. The issue is to then add the CO2 emissions reduction on top of that is what is breaking the camel's back. And this is where I do believe that external sources of funding need to be looked at in order to accelerate that process. And whereas Europe, for example, has had a much, much longer time to do that, we will have a much shorter time to catch up. So abatement technologies, in order to lower the carbon footprint of steelmaking, does have a technical limit, though, even for developed market producers, because where we are, particularly with blast furnace integrated operations, is we're now bumping up against the technological limits of how we know how to make steel. The next break is going to have to be done through a fairly breakthrough level of technology, which is why European steelmakers have come together in the ALCOS project to do this together and source government funding for it. Now, those technologies don't exist today. They're being trialed, particularly in one of our steel plants in France. But to make substantive progress from this point on, even that project will require government funding to some degree. And just briefly, this foresees a top gas recycling technology that will combine with carbon storage technologies, which clearly are not proven today. And so we are in very uncharted territory here. So that is the research part of it, and that is being done already on an industry-wide basis. How we in emerging markets then follow that trajectory and begin to invest of our own bet is where I think the Green Fund could play a role. And the extent to which there's own funding matched by that is, those are all details that can be worked out. But what I'm just putting on the table is, as the technologies become available, it is not automatic that they will be adopted because of the cost issue. And here the Green Fund will come into play. In terms of looking at the life cycle, in fact, there are extensive studies being done at the moment, particularly at ArcelorMittal. We're not doing this as an industry, we're doing it as a company, but much more focusing downstream. So we're looking at how steel gets used out of our factory gates and how that, having lowered our own carbon footprint to the extent that we can devise products to help our customers to do that. There is, for example, one I can quote you in the auto sector, where if you look at the steels that we've been producing for that sector over time, today the weight, for example, has come down very dramatically, and so you will find that the car that you will drive will also use less energy, therefore your carbon footprint will also be lessened. It's fair to say that the focus right now, because as I said, we feel that we're now bumping up against the technological limits of what we can do from a steel-making process. So the focus is really turned to energy and energy efficiency in particular. So for example, in South Africa, where today, historically, because we had such cheap energy, we didn't do as much to invest in capturing all of our waste heat gases and some of the process gases that we emit. We're doing all of that work now. And just coincidentally, that will also lower the carbon footprint of our operations. So I think it's fair to say that the steel industry is hugely committed to lowering its carbon emissions. It may not be something that Greenpeace generally talks about, but it's something that the industry takes very seriously as its own obligation and commitment as we move forward. We're looking at everything that is possible to be done in order to do this. What is also something we haven't articulated as much as we should is the fact that because steel is infinitely recyclable, for every ton that we produce, that ton can be used almost an infinite number of times with a very long lifespan, 40 years plus. And so if you're going to look at the carbon footprint of steel, theoretically you should be able to track it through its life cycle. And then, in fact, your carbon emission don't look quite so bad if you were able to do that. But now those are the kind of modeling that we haven't quite buttoned down yet, and we're in the process of doing. We've also devised solutions for housing, which take the same sort of thinking that we've been doing in the car industry into the housing market, both for affordable housing, which in fact we've just recently introduced in South Africa, and Minister, we've now got certification for it. So we've actually put up a couple of houses as a trial, together with insulation that comes together with the technology. So there's a whole bunch of things that we're doing that I think are being accelerated because everybody is looking at how their own industry sector can start contributing in this space. We haven't actually looked, no, not really. Not really, and as you asked that question, actually, I've got at the back of my mind to have a look at that because we haven't really, the mining boys are big boys and we tend to not be able to influence them as much as we can, our own customers.
Well, thank you very much. Any other questions? No other questions? Ricardo, I really want to give you the last word before we we close this session, because I've also noticed that we are running out of time, unless the panelists don't mind staying on for another 5-6 minutes, so that each of you can have like a last word. You don't mind? No? Okay, so I'll start with the ambassador this time. And Ricardo, you'll be the last one. Ambassador, 2 minutes. Anything else that you'd like to say? Even if it doesn't have to do with what we are discussing.
No, I mean, just to pick up on one thing that you said, energy efficiency. I think energy efficiency is probably what everybody realizes, the field where most gains in terms of, in the short term of carbon emissions can be made, and as you indicated, that is closely connected to the price, and I think that goes back to also having a trade regime that covers renewable energy technologies, because subsidies on fossil fuels are still at the level of, say, $500 billion globally, which means that in many markets it's simply not affordable to invest in renewable technologies, and that also means that the trade that where the potential is there doesn't happen, and we are really also, just to add on to what was said before, worried that there would be increasing protectionism in this current climate, and we feel very strongly that we should not have protectionism coming in, because that would be really going backwards in order to solve climate challenges. And actually, I will be. Kande referred to the Rio process and the whole situation in New York, where many developing countries think that green economy is another way of talking about green protectionism. Well, as an EU presidency, we will try to be very clear in the negotiations once they start in January, that this is indeed, I mean, that the green economy in our view has nothing to do with that. On the contrary, it is very much about finding common solutions amongst the member states of the UN, not in the climate field, but in the wider field of sustainable development. And that's where we will put our efforts. But hopefully that can also, if we find the right language, be conducive to helping both the Doha round and indeed also the UNFCCC to move on. I think there's in general just a need to refine the collaborative spirit of the UN here.
Yeah, and I think that's important actually for the green economy, because I truly believe that it must move forward. I think it's the only concept that talks about social inclusion, resource efficiency. Of course, there's the low carbon bit, which I'm not going to address now. But in any case, I mean, it's the only one that's actually socially inclusive. And therefore, we all have to talk about it in a manner that does not threaten or in any case doesn't cause discomfort in some of these countries. Harsha, you want to go next?
No, it's very good to hear about getting prepared to move ahead with a common kind of platform to get solutions. It was very good to hear that there may be initiatives to open markets for energy kind of thing. But in order to take them forward within the framework of discipline, clarifying the limits of where is it that there is a concern, what kind of issues are already covered, because I think if you take a look at the existing disciplines, in a large number of cases, those disciplines do act as a good insurance mechanism. It's when people want to go out of those disciplines that the protectionist intent becomes much more palpable. And if that is the case, then the minister is right. I think we first need to finish also on the existing business, and part of that business is to address many of these concerns. So I think we should get down to that, and it's a very useful system of disciplines, and if we don't focus on that through our own common intent, I think we'll only be weakening an existing good system and not managing much progress elsewhere.
Well, thank you very much. Minister?
Well, I think I would say that I think there's a need to bring a number of silos together. And I'm just thinking about the two panels I've been on today, because the question was raised in the context of ArcelorMittal about energy efficiency. And this morning I was at an initiative, we were talking about a standard called ISO 50001, which is all about that. And I think that is, in this conversation, we could pull some of these together. And I would suggest, for example, that if anybody's applying ISO 50001, there should be no case whatsoever for anybody to shove any border adjustment tax or any other kind of measure of that sort. That could be a possible kind of solution that we can possibly start to talk about. But I think that, just to say that I think there are many other dimensions to this conversation, and there's probably a need to integrate a lot more of these ideas around the basic objective is to promote industrial development that is, one, greener, that every existing industry's got to green itself and reduce its carbon footprint, but also that there's a whole bunch of new industries which are particularly related to this green industrial revolution, and we've got to have an equitable distribution of that, and we've got to have the conditions in place for the developing world and for the African continent in particular to share in that industrialization. That's my final word.
Thank you very much. Nonkululelo?
Well, just to, I guess in closing, that irrespective where this issue of the trade issues relating to climate change or vice versa get debated, whether it's a forum with a small f, with a big F, whether it's WTO, the one thing that for those people who have to actually live with it and execute it that we would really agitate for is consistency. So whatever comes out between those systems actually makes sense taken together or coherently. And so we would really welcome all of this, and hopefully it doesn't take too long, because the problem with things like this taking too long is companies and countries begin to feel the real effects of loss of competitiveness that then stimulate them to take unilateral action. It's starting to happen already, and unilateral action is probably the worst possible outcome, because these issues do have to be coordinated on a global level at some level. So the whole issue is just consistency and speed.
Thank you. Ricardo, you have the last word.
Well, thank you very much, Amina, and maybe let me use the opportunity of being the last one, since I cannot sort of separate again my role as a panelist and my role as an organizer, to also close the session and the symposium. But so before doing that, quickly on the substance that we have been discussing, maybe 3 quick points. One is that we have gone in this debate now through the most difficult issues that this, again, resolving this question of the linkages between trade policy and climate confront governments right now. So that's very clear. We have been, in a way, reviewing now some of those trade-offs that are so difficult to accommodate or to make. What is clear, I think, is that the imperative of action at the right scale, at the right pace, is what should probably drive then those policy choices. It's obvious that in Africa, as in most of the developing world, paraphrasing someone a couple of days ago in a dialogue with President Zuma, is poverty alleviation and development is not any longer about basket weaving. It's about jobs where they are necessary. It's about jobs in the cities. It's about jobs that do give the type of livelihoods that people are looking for. We need to better understand what type of developments we can generate with the kind of policies that can be put in place to respond to the climate challenge. And understand whether, for instance, jobs in the services industries and the services sector are as important as in manufacturing. So we have done some analysis, and we're trying to now deepen that analysis with respect to renewable energies. So of course there is a lot of enthusiasm about manufacturing capacity on renewable energy, but there are also gains and benefits economy-wide, as well as from a global perspective, if you like, on the services industries and the services side of those industries, of the renewable energy sectors. So I think that we need to understand better those and make sure that we don't fall in the old type of mercantilist approaches to defining trade policy and industrial policy. That's one quick reflection from the discussion that we just had. Then we need to make sure that if we apply this response to climate as the main driver for policy choices, then we also get very concerned about the environmental effectiveness or the carbon effectiveness of the policies that are designed and defined. So we should be worried about not using the green economy and, again, responses to climate in ways that are not responding to the challenge, and rather as a substitute for other type of policy objectives. And I think that that's also quite important. And then on that energy sector again, two more emphasis to add. One is that it's clear for all of us that on renewable energies we have a fight, as Ambassador Christensen was saying before, with fossil fuels that not only don't internalize the cost of carbon, but also get all this additional help in their competitiveness from subsidies both in the consumption and production ends. And that's why the case again to do whatever it's possible to do to try to help generate competitiveness for those industries is also justified. And the second one, the second point there is that competitiveness in any economy is to a great degree underpinned by energy and the energy supply mix. And as we move again to a low carbon world, that would be more and more the case. And so again, that's why it's not irrelevant to focus on the energy sector as we respond, obviously, to the climate challenge. Finally, I think that the point on silo thinking is a very important one. We keep repeating it all over the place. Policy coherence, try to move away with silos. In the case of the WTO, to go back to the multilateral trade system, we have proven, or we have seen proof in the past 15 years that it is possible to respond again to the priorities in other areas of policy, like in environment, through a good interpretation of the agreements, of the principles. There is a very good record on sustainable development now in the WTO. If those kind of principles and approaches are followed in other possibilities at the plurilateral, the bilateral, the regional level as well, I think that we have a way forward. In concluding, I think that the important message that comes out of this debate, and in a way from the past 2 days, is that countries have a responsibility to explore all possibilities and to do it against, in the case of climate change, against the urgency that comes from the ticking clock on the question of climate.